Alright, so you can see that I'm having some issues getting this bike to drop into first gear from neutral. Now I've checked out the service manual, and the most likely reason for this is that there's air in the clutch line. So it recommends that you flush and bleed out the clutch hydraulic line. Now in order to get to the clutch bleeder screw, you have to remove the starter motor. So in this video I'm going to go through the entire process of removing the starter motor, bleeding and flushing out the clutch hydraulic line, and then reinstalling the starter motor. I did publish a video on how to remove the starter motor, so if you want to jump to the section that deals with just flushing and bleeding out the clutch line, then check out the description below. I have chapter markings and timestamps for each of the different sections. Don't forget to also check out my channel. I have lots of other how-to videos on the R1200GS. Alright, let's get started. Alright, to remove the starter, you're going to need these tools: a socket wrench, 10mm socket universal joint, Torx T25 and T30 bit, small screwdriver, short 10mm wrench, torque wrench, wire cutter, wire tie, and magnetic pick. You also need some waterproof grease for the starter motor neck. And the tools you'll need to flush the clutch are a socket wrench, a Torx T20 bit, 6mm wrench, a rubber hose, a siphon, and then some replacement clutch fluid, which would be the Vitamol V10, about 100 milliliters. First thing we need to do is remove the battery cover using the Torx T25 bit. The battery cover has two plastic fingers that go into rubber grommets on the frame. Next, we want to remove the negative side of the battery using a 10mm socket. Move the wires away from the battery. Next, remove the battery strap. And then the plastic battery holder. This piece also has two plastic fingers that slide into the battery box. Now carefully slide out the battery. There is a hard foam base that sits under the battery. Now remove the positive side of the battery, also using a 10mm socket. Be careful not to touch the negative side of the battery with the socket wrench. Now it's time to remove the oxygen sensor connectors. Now remove the exhaust flow control valve servo connector. Now we're going to remove the servo mounting screw using a Torx T30 bit. Slide the servo out to the left. It also has two plastic fingers that need to slide out of rubber grommets. The servo is still connected to the exhaust flow control, so it won't come out completely. Now we have to remove the negative wire to the starter motor using a Torx T30 bit. Now we want to remove the positive wire to the starter motor, but first we have to remove this plastic cover that protects the terminal. This plastic cover has two clips that hold it in place. Here's a better look of where those two clips are. Now we can remove the positive wire to the starter motor using a 10mm wrench. There isn't a lot of room here, so I had to use a short wrench. Next we have to remove the two bolts holding the starter motor in. We'll start with the upper bolt first. You'll need a Torx T30 bit to remove this bolt. There isn't enough room to get a socket wrench in here, so I had to use a long socket extension. Once the bolt came out about halfway, there wasn't enough room to come straight at the bolt, so I had to use a smaller Torx bit on an angle to get it all the way out, and then use the magnet to get it all the way out. Now remove the lower starter bolt using the same Torx T30 bit. Now cut the wire tie at the upper bolt part of the starter. Now you can remove the starter motor from the engine block. The starter motor fits tightly, so you'll have to slide it straight out. There are two sensor wires that are blocking it from coming out, so you'll have to slide those wires to the inside of the motor. There's still something that's preventing it from coming out. This is where those two wires need to slide around. And here's a closer look at those two wires. I noticed there was some wear on this bolt bracket. I then realized that this bracket that holds the exhaust and the servo was preventing the starter motor from coming out as well. You can remove the two bolts that hold in that bracket, and then slide the bracket to the left to allow the starter to come out. There are a couple wires that might be in the way, so wire tie them off to the side. Now you'll have access to the clutch release cylinder, and it has a bleed screw that we'll use to flush out the line. Now connect a hose to the bleed screw to drain off the old fluid. Get your 6mm wrench ready, but don't open up the valve yet. Now move the handlebars and try to get the clutch reservoir as level as possible. Put some paper towels around the reservoir in case you spill some of the clutch fluid. Use a Torx T20 bit to remove the 4 reservoir screws. Inspect the rubber gasket on the lid for any wear or cracks and replace if needed. To save some time, we're going to siphon out some of the clutch fluid from the reservoir. Leave a little fluid in the reservoir to prevent air from getting into the line. And now time to add the new fluid. Fill up the reservoir about 75% and then put the lid back on. Now press in the clutch very slowly and then release it very slowly. This will ensure that some of the new fluid that we just put in is now in the line. Now press and hold the clutch, do not release. With the clutch lever still pulled in, open up the bleed screw and let the fluid drain out. Close the bleed screw once the fluid stops moving. Now you can release the clutch lever and then press and hold again. Open up the bleed screw, let the fluid drain out, and then close again. Release the lever and then keep repeating this process. Be sure to check the reservoir periodically and not let it run dry. Keep repeating this process until all of the old clutch fluid is removed. Don't forget to keep checking the reservoir and not let it run dry. I kept repeating this process until I had just enough fluid to top off the reservoir at the end. Once you're done, close everything up and be sure not to over tighten those screws. Inspect the O-ring on the starter and replace if needed. Now we're going to clean off the old white grease that was on the starter neck. Then lubricate the O-ring with some fresh engine oil. Also put some new white grease onto the starter neck. Now we're going to clean up the opening where the starter motor fits. Now we can reinstall the starter motor. Again, this would probably be easier if you get the servo and exhaust bracket out of the way. Be sure to get those two sensor wires on the outside of the motor. Now we can bolt the starter motor back in. We'll start with the upper bolt first. The only way I was able to get this bolt back in is by gluing the bolt to the Torx bit. And you'll need a Torx T30 bit to do this. We're going to screw it in a few turns just to get it started. Now we'll screw in the lower bolt. And we'll need a Torx T30 bit for this one as well. Screw the lower bolt all the way in, and then we'll go back to the upper bolt and screw that all the way in. Now torque down both bolts to 12 Newton meters. Now fish back in a wire tie to tie down those wires to the starter motor. Now screw back in the negative wire to the starter motor. You'll need a Torx T30 bit for this, and then torque down that bolt to 10 Newton meters. Reconnect the positive wire to the starter motor. Tighten down the nut with a 10mm wrench. And reinstall the terminal cover. Mount the servo back onto the bracket. Reinstall the servo mount screw and tighten down using a Torx T30 bit. And you'll want to torque this bolt to 10 Newton meters. Now reconnect the oxygen sensor connectors. And the servo connector. And now we can reinstall the battery. We'll reconnect the positive wire to the battery first. Tighten down using a 10mm socket. And torque to 7 Newton meters. Slide the battery back in, and don't forget the foam base. Reconnect the black negative wires to the negative side of the battery. Tighten down using a 10mm socket and torque to 7 Newton meters. Now we'll install the battery holder. Make sure the two plastic fingers slide down into the battery box. Now we can reattach the rubber battery strap. And now we can reattach the battery cover. You'll need a Torx T25 bit for the battery cover screw. And torque to 2 Newton meters. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the like button and consider subscribing to my channel so you can be the first kid on your block to be notified when I release a new video. Thanks again, and ride safe.